Alrighty, we have now made it to Chapter 4, Social Development in Infancy and Childhood. Here are the learning objectives per usual. Feel free to pause the learning objectives if you wish to read them. More learning objectives. Socialization is the process where children basically learn who they are, how to behave, what's right, what's wrong. Most of that socialization comes from their dominant family, especially the parents, but also socialization comes from their siblings. Analyze the family environment. So families are what is promoted from socialization. They have the biggest impact on a child and how they view the world, their perception and their experiences with anybody that's outside of them. So depending on what's going on with the family, whether it's their resources or their social climate, that basically tells the child who they're going to be, how they're going to be, and what's acceptable as far as what's going on now. Of course, more goes into that with the media and teachers and school, but initially it starts with the family since the child spends the most time with their family. So this could include socioeconomic status. It could include the types of foods they eat, their cultural values, their moral values. And then we move on to the family structure. So family structure is not just the traditional family structure where it was a man and wife and the child or two, which we would call a nuclear family. Families have moved beyond that, and they basically are a group of people that come together for a common goal. They work together. They have obligations toward one another and responsibility toward one another. So that could include grandparents that might be in the home. It could include two people who live together but aren't married by the government. Those can also be called common law marriages. It could be families that are from divorced families coming together. So there's step-parents, step-children. There are just different types of families. There are some same-sex families. There are kids that are adopted. There are single-parent homes. There are grandparents that are raising their grandchildren. There are blended families. It's just a group of people that live in a household that cohabitate, that respect one another, that live together, that work together, that have common goals as far as what's going on with the family and what the goals are of the family. And children learn about the world just by being raised in varying environments. So there are a lot of positives when it comes to family functioning. There are morals and values that are learned. There's socialization. People are getting support materially, financially, emotionally. They learn how to communicate. They learn negotiation and self-esteem and compromises. And as with anything that we talk about in this class and in this text, we have to look at the different systems that are out there that affect families. So a macro system you might think about would be maybe healthcare for the nation. So that would just depend. That would obviously affect the family and the different family members involved, and it would depend on what's going on with the healthcare. It could be some type of universal health care that everyone has access to, or it could be the parent and or parents might have health care through their jobs and therefore pass it down to the child, or the child might have a disability and be placed on Medicaid. The older adults in the family might be on Medicare if they're in the U.S. So it just depends on what's going on with the macro systems and how that would affect family members. There are also dynamics to the family systems, differences in how people behave. You probably have heard information about if someone is a firstborn child versus a lastborn versus a single child. There is some truth to that, and there are some research around that, but there isn't like a consensus of saying this is exactly how a child will come out, just depending on the socialization and who that child is within themselves. So it's sort of like nature versus nurture, that question, where it seems to be a little bit of both. Um, so the dynamics when it comes to that aren't always going to be foretold, but having siblings does help when it comes to play or understanding life, or fighting, arguing, coming to a consensus or an agreement. um, and then also thinking about how parents, like what their values are. Maybe their values are education, spending time with one another, different family members. So that could be another way of being socialized. But depending on what's going on with the family, has a direct effect on the kids. So it could be divorce, or it could be celebrations of different members of the family. Systems theory concepts are being applied to families in this section. So a system is elements that work together. They're interrelated, they function as a whole, and they're in some type of orderly set. So a family could be a system. Parents can work as their own system. They can be a subset of a system or a subsystem. Children can act as a subsystem. Pets can act as a subsystem. Maybe like mother, son, father, daughter, or vice versa can act as a subsystem, but they're all still part of the family working together. Homeostasis is like when everything is copacetic, so everything is peaceful, harmonized, people are working together, communicating. Then we have boundaries, and we know that it's a way of delineating a system from another. So basically separating a system from another, even though they can still work together overall. We have input, and that's any energy or any information of communication or anything being taken into the family. Output would be all the energy or information or communication that is going out of the family. You can also look at that as maybe paying bills, and maybe input can be looked at as um, knowledge that is gained and what the parents teach the children, or even as earned income. Then we have feedback, and that's the information of what's coming back into the family as far as evaluation and knowing what's going on, and trying to understand, is this family working as a positive system or a negative system, if there are changes that need to be made. As long as everybody's still working together. Then there is entropy, and that is the tendency for things to come to an end. That could be people aging or dealing with a disability, and maybe it's getting worse over time in the family. Negative entropy, even though it sounds negative, is actually a positive. So it's when there is a system that's moving as far as a family goes, but they're growing and developing over time, and they're supporting one another. Then there's equifinality, and that deals with that there's many ways to come to an end. So different things could cause the ending of a family or ending of a situation. It could be the loss of a job. It could be divorce. It could be death. And then there is differentiation, and that is when people start off simplified and their system gets more complicated. So it could be that a couple got together and then they ended up adopting children. So now their system has more going into it and is more complicated. Or it could be the children that they have, maybe one of them has an illness, so that adds on another layer of complications. Learning theory. So the theory that can be applied to family has to do with learning. So we are going to look at that, and that starts on page 175 of your textbook. But basically, it's just looking at the way the social environment has an effect on behavior. You could think of events from beforehand or consequences from certain behaviors, but basically just looking at how behavior, environment, and different people have an effect on learning. It's important that behaviors are observable and that they can be measured, and it ends in a positive approach to dealing with those behaviors for family members. There are different types of treatment, which would be behavior modification, and that can be backed up basically by using different types of conditioning. So we have respondent conditioning, and that's basically where there's a stimulus or something that's outside of the person that can influence a person. So it could be the smell of things, it could be the taste of something, it could be hearing something, but that can have an effect on someone's behavior. So a stimulus can be used to for encouragement of a positive behavior, especially when it comes to children. So an unconditioned stimulus is something that just happens automatically that the body reacts to, but having a conditioned stimulus, you can condition, children to react to a bell. It means that class is over, or maybe it means that class is starting. So you can take a certain stimulus or a thing and have a reaction to it. So you might hear of that being Pavlovian. That deals with Pavlov's dogs when it comes to ringing the bell and conditioning the dogs to react to the stimulus of the bell and salivating, knowing that they're going to get food every time they hear the bell. Then we have modeling, and that's basically being or behaving in a certain way that a child can look at and model and observe. There is also desensitization, and that's basically having somebody get used to something that they're scared of over time. And then also replacing maybe that anxiety and fear they get from that phobia with like relaxation techniques. Then we move on to operant conditioning. And that's usually what is used in the US, but it basically deals with behaviors, and we're basically trying to influence that positive behavior with operant conditioning. We want behaviors that could be shaped, so it could be used for good, and also to get rid of like negative behaviors or bad behaviors that a child just might start doing. So we have antecedents, and those are events that occur immediately before the behavior itself. So it could be a situation that occurs, and then a child may develop a negative response from that. So maybe watching too many violent video games or watching too many cartoons that have violence in it, and then the child starts to act out in that way. That just would be because that's what they're seeing continuously. And behavior, as I already mentioned, is something that is able to be measured and able to be viewed. There's consequences for behavior. So to make it positive, it could be supportive when a child is doing good on something, or you can use it as a way of getting rid of a behavior, and that would be maybe taking something away from them for a while or putting them on timeout for a while. So reinforcement is when you want to increase a positive behavior, and you're going to increase the frequency of that behavior. So positive reinforcement is all about strengthening positive behaviors. Negative reinforcement is removing things, so that way the person won't continue that behavior. Additionally, they also want to make sure that behavior doesn't continue over time. Then there is punishment. So there's different types of punishments. Of course, you want the punishment to be something that is appropriate for the situation and is good for the age, or is appropriate for the age. And they also want to decrease a type of behavior with this punishment, but it has to happen like right after the undesired behavior. And it also can relate to what they just did, and it has to be explained beforehand for punishment to really work. So saying that you're going to have a timeout if you keep screaming, and letting the child know beforehand. And then moving on to extinction. That is where you're trying to get rid of a behavior and hopefully get to an extinction overall. And basically you want to stop the frequency of a certain behavior and hopefully have a decrease where you no longer have to give them any type of reinforcement for the behavior to be gone. It just ends up disappearing over time. There's a thing called an extinction burst, and that's where there's a brief increase in the behavior once that person gets to the point where they don't really do it anymore. And then usually it stops after that. when it comes to reinforcements, there are there's primary reinforcement and secondary reinforcers. So primary would be um, things such as food, water, just things that people can respond to and get satisfaction from, or a craving met, or a behavior that they want based off of what they're getting. So, of course, if someone's thirsty and they go for the act to drink and they drink, and so that is already a reinforcement to keep drinking water. The secondary reinforcer would be something like money, where a person is given money and they know it's going to be used to acquire that water. Some people use tokens for to help kids behave in school, just in the same manner, because they can trade it in later for either an activity or for maybe the thing that they want, the prize. So as far as activities go, if a person does well, a child, they can have an activity that they participate in. Maybe going outside to play on the swings for a while. Of course, having the social reinforcers activated at the same time, which would be saying good job, good work. And then physical reinforcement, which would be like a hug or a high five. I mentioned tokens already and how those could be used to purchase or trade for what they want. You have to think about the quality of reinforcement. So you have to make sure that if you want the behavior to continue, that the quality of the enforcement is positive. So they actually like what they're getting, or they like the prize, or like the attention, or whatever it might be. It might be going to the movies, it may be going to a theme park, just depending on whatever the situation is. So immediately reinforce the behavior after you see a desired behavior in a child, and continue to enforce that behavior over time. Some people do intermittent reinforcement. It's not as strong as the other types of reinforcement. And intermittent is where the child's not knowing exactly when they're going to get the good job, but they are going to get it sometimes and other times not. But all of these types of reinforcers are in aid to the child of shaping their behavior. There is also the use of punishment. Of course, you don't want punishment to be something that is aggressive or negative, because the following things can happen. First, it can make the child feel negative emotion. They can start just applying that negative emotion to the person that did the punishment. They might become aggressive themselves. The child might end up being harmed. And it also tells them what they shouldn't do, but it doesn't teach them what they should do. So, of course, if someone's going to be punished in a certain way, hopefully there's some positive in there too to teach them how you want them to act, or what that do you want them to actually do, versus just saying don't do this, don't do that. Replace that behavior. Talk to the child. Reinforce how you want them to behave by things that they're interested in or things that they like. Membership in family systems, and then also dealing with subsystems, which would be siblings or cousins, like a grandparent and a grandchild, maybe father and son having a special relationship. But there are different types of control that can be done by parents. So there's permissive parenting, where the parents aren't really involved and they avoid control. They're not really into dealing with their children. Then there's permissive indulgence, or permissive rejecting, and that's where they ignore or shun their children. Then there is authoritarian, and that is where they basically want things to be done their way, or that's it, and they're really strict with that. And then there's authoritative, and that's just like a mix in between the two. And they also include the children when it comes to the issues dealing with their families, or having a voice and learning how to compromise over time. Now, there are brothers and sisters that are part of the sibling subsystems, and usually when a new child is coming or adopted in, there might be some issues within the subsystems, but there are ways that families can work together to get over it, or at least to support one another and dealing with the situation. They could go to therapy, which would be family therapy when dealing with social work, and making sure that children are told before things change, so that way they have a way overall um, to help deal with it. Assess relevant aspects of the social environment. So children learn what to do, what's okay, from their parents predominantly, but when it comes to interacting with their peers, they learn a lot through play or through sports. Um, so children are able to, of course, develop their muscles while they're playing, develop their minds. They're able to become creative, communicate, play together, play alongside one another, relate to others, um, and basically tells them how they want to accomplish whatever goal that they might have during their play or with the other children. So play is very important. There are different types of play. There's solitary play by themselves, side-by-side play, which they call parallel play. Um, there are types of interactions depending on what a child is doing, but there's other types that don't have any interaction. That could be with a kid just watching other kids play. Even if they're thinking in their head, but they might not have approached the situation yet. But when kids have cooperative play where they're with one another, they're really gaining a lot of different behavioral responses and positive cues and social cues just from being part of a group. And so that is important. And then over time, when it comes to gender differences, some people like to ask about nature and nurture when it comes to gender differences because as adults we treat children differently, depending if they're a boy or girl, just the way the U.S. society is. However, some believe that there are some inherent things about them that make them different. So inherent would be things that they're born with. Like there's data that shows that boys start playing more aggressively um, by age 3. So, and usually that's encouraged. However, if a girl plays aggressively, usually that is discouraged. Or if there's boys and girls playing together, um, if a girl wants to join the boys who are playing aggressively, usually someone will say something so the girl doesn't end up getting hurt, and that's said. So that's still some type of socialization that we're getting um, from the adults when children are playing or just in class with one another. Um, Also, we looked at a little bit of bullying, and just seeing like the habits or some of the behaviors people have when it comes to bullying. So some people bully because they want to feel important, they want an audience, they want people to see what they're doing, and other students who are the victims of being bullied, um, they usually aren't outgoing. They might be shy or withdrawn or have some behavior that others might deem annoying. And then over time, they are more depressed. They think about suicide or actually commit suicide and have more mental health stresses and problems when they get older. Cyberbullying is when it basically doesn't stop. It's 24/7, 7 days a week. It deals with electronic devices. The children can't get away with it. And then a lot of that information can't be erased because it's just spread around. Whatever's on the internet is on the internet. And so it's not like back in the day where kids, if they had a bully or someone they had to deal with, that they fought or dealt with, it was just that situation and only known there, unless they let other people know. But the way the world is now, with cyberbullying, it could literally just happen all the time, and children have a lot of access to social media. Um, Studies have shown that children might start to experience some type of bullying during middle school or type of teasing if it doesn't get all the way to bullying. And then there is the influence of looking at the media. So the media, or at least what the textbook talked about, was dealing with violence and the cartoons that children watch or the video games that they play or whatever is on TV and movies, whatever it might be, lets kids know that violence, at least in the U.S., isn't too bad. Even talking about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and how they have to fight the bad guys, you can apply that to a lot of cartoons. and it shows that children do fight or people do fight to get things done. So there has been some effect, of course, on children overall from watching and participating in violent actions that they see or have been a part of. And then also the amount of school shootings that happen in the U.S., it has become part of a social norm, even though that is disturbing, but it's something that they hear about. They have drills for it, and there's large groups of teens that have stories later on to tell about school shootings. You ever interested in some of those? They are on YouTube. You just type in horror stories, school lockdowns or shootings, and there's a lot of them out there. Additionally, the school environment has an impact on the kids. So it could be the peers, also the teachers and how they support the child. That has a big effect on their behavior. So all they need is just one person, usually to believe in them, and usually that child could improve their grades and it could improve their behavior. This chapter at the end did go into maltreatment of children. And that starts on 213 till the end of the book. So just so you know, for those who might be triggered, depending on the type of maltreatment they're talking about, but it goes into various types. It does give examples, and it does give some evidence as far as articles goes and research goes when it comes to this. This PowerPoint talks about the amount of children that had to have referrals through social services, but it's referring to 2014 because the book is from 2015. So there are and there will be updated numbers on your discussion post that you'll do for this chapter, but there is physical child abuse, and or maltreatment, which you could call it, and then there's also neglect. So children not getting what they need physically, or with the abuse, they're getting punished and abused in a way that is hurting them in some manner. So things for social workers to look out for, or medical workers or teachers: bruises, lacerations, fractures, burns, head injuries, intentional injuries, children that continuously get hurt, and then some behaviors could be behavioral extremes of people just being really quiet, withdrawn, really submissive, or people as children having extreme violent outbursts. So it just depends on the child, and then also developmental lags need to be taken into account because it could point to some type of abuse. Moving on, there are different characteristics of abusers. So this book goes into how they have low self-esteem, they have poor parenting skills, they don't cope with things well in general, whether it's their job, stress, their family. They didn't get their needs met. So for some people, they don't know how to meet their children's needs, and other people, that's just how they maintain control. So they don't meet others' needs, and that would be forms of neglect, and that's just keeping resources away from the child. It could be medical resources, it could be food as resources or nutrition, it could be the love that they need. So just keeping what they need away from them. And also, if it's a baby, it can relate to failure to thrive. And poverty is seen in a lot of these circumstances because poverty does go hand in hand with stress. Of course, all impoverished people do not abuse children, but there is a risk for abuse for children that come from impoverished homes or impoverished environments. So things to look into would be physical health care, mental, educational, supervision, and these are all things that can be neglected when it comes to children. They could be abandoned. The house could have hazards or things that are out that could contribute to them getting hurt. And then additionally, there would be, depending on the situation, food might be spoiled or old, or they might not have access to food, lack of personal hygiene, lack of nutrition, lack of social skills, lack of attachment to the parents, lack of attachment to any family, depending on what they've dealt with. They might have cognitive deficits of how they think or understand things, and then also academic deficits could be reflected from that, and then emotional and behavior problems. So those are some things that children might deal with. The book also goes into non-organic failure to thrive and psychosocial dwarfism, just depending on how much neglect and maltreatment children have gone through. The book goes into specifically the mother. The book talks about mothers that are indifferent, lazy, impulsive, irresponsible, depressed, and kind of just checks out, those with intellectual disabilities, and those with serious mental health issues, where they are unable to take care of their children. And then the book goes into different examples, which you can see on page 220 and 221 if you're interested in that. The book also talks about psychological abuse, belittling, rejecting, undermining, basically tearing at who the child is internally and decreasing their self-esteem, rejection, isolation, terrorizing them, ignoring any failings the child may have, or ignoring any positive the child may have, and corrupting them, like maybe encouraging them to sell drugs or join gangs or shoplift, or even, drinking. Some parents are the first persons to give their child alcohol or drugs. Then there are other issues that kids go through, and hopefully using the macro system, there will be ways to help the child through social workers, dealing with the courts, removal of children. Hopefully there's somewhere positive for the children to go to when they dealt with CPS. But it basically depends on what's going on with the situation, what's the baseline, are there parents who care in the situation, are they trying to do better? Usually CPS and the court system wants to keep families together. That is not always the case, but seeing if the parents are taking the appropriate steps to be better parents, removing any negative behaviors such as abuse or drugs, and hopefully providing resources and treatment as far as therapy or medical resources for those that might need it. Might be individual and group counseling, understanding the victims and letting them express themselves and learning how to advocate for themselves. So there's petitions that can be put into the system of letting people know that a child is being abused, adjudication, and that's where both parties has a lawyer and they can deal with the situation depending on the type of neglect and abuse that occurred. And then a disposition would basically be a hearing where you find out the outcome of what the court wants to do with the child. There are factors that deal with child abuse. So it could be the child being young or having disabilities or not yet being able to speak, depending on the caregiver. Abusers might be somebody who has a history of it or being irrational. Environmental factors could be not having all the needs met, such as lack of water, lack of clean housing, lack of housing, mistreatment at home, not having their feelings met, or resources. Then the book goes into sexual abuse. There's different types of sexual abuse. The book in this chapter on page 224 focuses more on incest, since that is the largest type of abuse in the U.S. There's also trafficking. And then usually, as far as when people just say pedophiles, even though incest has pedophilia in it, but when it comes to strangers, it's only about 5 to 15% of actual abuse. Most abuse, as far as sexually goes, comes from someone that the children or child knows. There is a progression. There's 5 phases. There's an engagement phase where the person kind of experiments to see how the child is going to react to it, whether it's physically doing something to the child or showing them something. And then there's the second act, and that is the sexual interaction phase. Then there's a third phase of secrecy, and then the fourth phase of dealing with disclosure, when they actually tell somebody what's going on. And then suppression could be dealing with the family or the victim just not wanting to deal with it on a daily basis. Or even people in the family maybe trying to minimize it or pretend something didn't happen. There are risk factors. Some research shows it's more girls. Most research shows it's more girls. Some say that boys of younger ages, it's specified 3 to 6, are also abused at similar rates. Um, it also goes into having a mother who's not readily available, so maybe she's working a lot. The family is isolated. They don't have a lot of money. There's absence of the biological parent in the home, so it might be a step parent that's doing it. In a family that has a lot of issues with conflict or communication, so the child might not feel like they're able to tell that what's going on with them. And then the book went into how the internet contributes to child predators, because now they will use the internet as a means of contacting children. They'll hang around children's games like Roblox. They'll hang around children's bulletins in order to get the child or children to trust them. So there's a lot of that goes on with the internet. There are some indicators in the book. It could be children having STIs or STDs, having issues with bruises or pregnancy, low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation or behavior, or children being precocious or promiscuous, having post-traumatic stress disorder, panic, anxiety attacks. Usually if the child has someone that they can feel safe with, over time, it helps mitigate or it helps protect the child overall, even if they have been abused in some way. Having something done to the abuser and letting the child know that something is done, and making sure the child is safe after they have finally been able to disclose it. Some people don't disclose what happened to them until they're adults, and others will say something when it happens, and hopefully the family members are there to positively deal with the situation, have the person arrested, have it documented, have the child checked out and examined and treated in all the ways that they need, physically, emotionally, just making sure that they're okay. They would have to look at the relationship of the perpetrator to the kid as far as social work goes. Think about how long the abuse has happened, how forceful and how devastating it was. And that still isn't taken away from those that are psychologically abused, because that can also be devastating. And then making sure that the child has different types of support. So social workers, hopefully, once they can disclose this information, they can advocate for the child, they can bring awareness to society for these situations and awareness to family members that need to know what's going on. Have goals in mind to make sure that the behavior either stops or the child is no longer able to be near that person. Teaching survivors to identify how they feel and to express that. And then also dealing with communication and support, enhancing who they have around them and what support is around them to help. And it's important to use trauma-informed care. That could be for any type of trauma that children have gone through, or even adults that haven't had their trauma dealt with. I'm just making sure that people realize these type of things are widespread, they're not alone, to know the signs and symptoms, to know how to respond to it. So make sure schools understand, make sure people, victims and survivors understand how it could impact their health as a kid and how their health as an adult, and taking preventative measures to make sure those things don't happen, and to make sure that they don't feel alone in dealing with these types of abuses, and hopefully get the resources they need so that abuse won't continue. It's important to educate families and children's and community and everybody about these things, making sure children know that they can say no if they don't want to hug someone or touch someone, because a lot of the times perpetrators will use the fact that children obey adults and are taught to obey. They'll use that to their advantage when it comes to children, to get them not to say anything, or to get the kid to think that the person couldn't be doing anything bad to them because it's someone they trust. So the book ends talking about the abuse on page 30. If you want more detail on it, you can refer to the textbook.